You're listening to the Pens Nation radio show on thepensnation.com. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePensNation.
And it's the show that you don't have to shell out the big bucks for. It's the Pens Nation radio show. Welcome to NHL Free Agency, everybody. It's been a chaotic day thus far, and we're going to get into that in just a little bit. You can follow the show on Twitter at the Pens Nation. You can follow me at PensNation_Nick, as well as Ken Will here at PensNationK. And we're joined tonight by Mike Colligan of the Hockey Writers and Forbes magazine. Mike's always doing great work over there and wherever he goes, honestly. So you can follow him on the Twitter machine at Mike Colligan, all one word there. And Mike, thanks for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Nick. And guys, the interesting day, that's for sure. You know, you alluded to the money that was being thrown around. It seems like every summer we see more and more and more. And, I don't think it's a problem. And I see a lot of people connect that to a future lockout or this is why we have problems. I mean, the players are going to get the money one way or another. They get half of league revenues. The question is who gets that money. And I think what we're seeing is a trend towards star players getting more and more and more of that 50% of revenues. And that's the shocking thing. It's the guys that didn't sign today. They're going to get squeezed out. They're going to get the, under $1 million overs. And I think that's the real shift that I'm seeing as far as free agency goes.
Yeah, there are definitely some big winners and losers today. Mike, Jim Rutherford and the Pens, what do you think today? Big winners or big losers?
Both, actually. I think the Christian Ehrhoff deal, that's a steal. That is to get him at $4 million, I think is fortunate. It is a good move for the Penguins. It was kind of a perfect storm where you weren't going to get a player like him for 1 year and $4 million at any point, but the fact that he was bought out and paid as much money as he was puts you in a great position as the Pittsburgh Penguins to offer him that opportunity. And what was interesting today is, off the top of my head, I think every player signed for 1 year. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there's an opportunity for players to come to Pittsburgh, just as UC Jokinen did, as we've seen in the past, where players come to Pittsburgh, get an opportunity to put up some pretty incredible offensive stats, and that's what teams compensate for. It's Stanley Cups and offensive stats. That's really what it comes down to. If you don't have either of those, you probably weren't one of the guys today that was getting the big money.
I think we saw that today. UC Jokinen, Tanner Glass, Joe Vitale, Brooks Orpik, Matt Niskanen, Derek England, all signing with teams totaling $124.9 million for former Penguins spent today. Christian Ehrhoff signed within the first 5 minutes of free agency, but he's got to be looking at that as someone who was just bought out, and he's on a 1-year deal now. And this is just a real chance to show the league that, he has an ability to cash in next July 1st.
And that's exactly right. Is really a lot of these deals are setting up for that. And I think a guy like Ehrhoff, he's got his money. He needs to really cash in again. If you're his agent, or if I'm his agent, I'm saying, let's go out there. You're coming off of a year in Buffalo where there are a lot of negative attention. He actually had a good year. I watched some of the games where he was by far their only competent player on that roster by the end of the year. But it just gets overshadowed for how bad Buffalo was. So for him, this is an opportunity to come into a good team, get the attention that a guy like, look at Matt Niskanen. I mean, perfect example where as a third pairing defenseman against mediocre matchups, he's able to cash in and get over $40 million. If he can get that, Christian Ehrhoff with one solid season, I think can certainly fetch the same thing on the open market next summer.
Now, Matt Niskanen was a guy that a lot of Penguins fans are sad to see go. Certainly was a big part of the Penguins' blue line this past regular season, and especially into the playoffs. We saw him fill in holes in the power play whenever Paul Martin was injured or Chris Letang was injured, and he can certainly do the same in Washington. The big question, though, is he worth the contract that he got with the Capitals?
It's a great question. I think Niskanen, I want to say he is in a bubble, and that's the way I'll probably phrase a lot of these situations tonight is, we can look at individual players, but I think you have to consider the team, the cap situation of the team, the defense. If we're talking about Matt Niskanen, I think Matt Niskanen makes sense in Washington. Brooks Orpik does not. Brooks Orpik at that price would make sense in Florida. A team that has tons of cap space, needs a veteran, needs a guy with experience and a Stanley Cup on his belt. In Washington makes absolutely no sense, and that's where I think it's very important to consider these situations and where these players are when we're talking about some salaries that are either very good or very bad. And when you talk about Ehrhoff, you say, okay, it's a situation for him that makes sense. It leads to probably a bigger payday next summer, and it gives the Penguins the flexibility right now to bring in a very good defenseman that I think gives them options on the back end as far as trades or just ushering in a lot of these young prospects that are unproven at this point.
Brooks Orpik at $5 million in Washington Capitals. Maybe next year it makes sense, but over 5 years term, how is that rationalized?
I'll tell you what, I don't even think next year makes sense. I really don't, with the regression I've seen out of him for, I'll put it at 18 months now, back to really the lockout. I think the half season last year, or 2 years ago, and the full season last year, where he continues to struggle with injuries. He's only getting older, and he's a guy that I think on the ice was not the same. And part of it was mental, and I think as the physical skills start to fade, that's what we saw with Brooks Orpik. He was a guy that as he lost that confidence, never knew when to pinch, never knew when to back up, and oftentimes would back in on Marc-Andre Fleury because he had no faith in his ability to really have an effective gap control. And that's what, we used to hear Dan Bilesma talk about all the time, but it's basically you want to stay within more or less a stick length of the player that's attacking you. And if you're facing Phil Kessel, that means you have to skate backwards pretty fast. And Brooks Orpik was not capable of that anymore. So his way of compensating for that was just back into the goal, and that means you never get beat wide, but you give talented players a ton of space. And I think that was the problem I saw with Orpik, especially this past season, was just no confidence in his skating ability anymore. And when that starts to go, then now you've got mental factors, physical factors that are fading, and it really leads into a downward spiral. So I think next year, I don't think I'd pay him $5 million, let alone where he'll be in 5 years.
Now, a lot of people thought that once the Pens signed Christian Ehrhoff, that Paul Martin was as good as gone. Do you see Martin on the Pens roster next season, Mike?
I do not. No. I think the latest I heard there, and at this time of year, I'll preface it with this: you hear a ton of things. 99% of it is false. And that's the problem, is sorting through what that 1% is. And oftentimes, even you could have a lot of things that are legitimately possible, but they don't come to fruition. The trade deadline's another example where there's so many trades that are talked about. And these GMs, I think if fans would hear all the trades that GMs talk about, their minds would be blown at the players that are just casually discussed or semi-seriously discussed. And at this point, I know Paul Martin had no interest under the former coaching staff of staying with the Penguins. I don't know what his current status is, but he has 1 year left on his contract, and I think as you're looking to usher in a new generation of defensemen, you now basically have Paul Martin and his replacement in Christian Ehrhoff. And that, for me, was the key, is you need to have a guy in there like Paul Martin if you're going to move on. And I think the fact that they now have two guys with 1 year on their contracts, to me, I think Paul Martin's the odd man out. Now it's a matter of, can you find a team that's going to give you a legitimate return? I thought they rushed the James Neal deal a little bit, didn't get the maximum return. If I'm the Penguins, I take my time with Paul Martin and see who are the teams that miss out on the top defensive free agents and who's really going to need a defenseman that can play 25 minutes a night, penalty kill, power play against top competition. They're going to need Paul Martin. They'll pay for it.
Now, speaking of James Neal here, I mean, that all went down during the draft. Did you find it at all a bit peculiar that, that trade happened during the draft but involved 0 draft picks whatsoever?
Yeah, I've been asked that a few times by people, and my take on it is, Nick, you were there for the draft, and you saw how that kind of went down, and the Penguins, I think, were in heavy talks with Colorado. What I heard since then is perhaps the offer was P.A. Parenteau in a first, and we saw that Parenteau eventually made his way to Montreal in the Daniel Briere trade. But I think if I had to justify or back Jim Rutherford and the Penguins for why they did that on draft day, despite not having draft picks involved, it would be because I think you have to create a bidding war. You have to have other teams involved, and I'd imagine that there were other teams that had draft picks involved, and I just mentioned Colorado as one that supposedly had a first rounder in play. I think you've got to take that all into consideration and say, okay, when are we going to have really this auction mentality where a team like Nashville, although not offering draft picks, has to compete with that? And so that would be my way of defending it. But I think in hindsight, what it left them with was no obvious solution for filling James Neal's spot. From the words that we heard from Jim Rutherford, he thought he was going to find a solution and a fix for Evgeny Malkin's line. Today, he more or less totally backed off of those comments and said he doesn't need a top six winger anymore. And I think that's very telling, and that would be my concern as I looked at the James Neal deal ahead of free agency is you're trading Neal assuming you're going to get a guy like Kulemin or Mahalik or Ales Hemsky, whoever it was. They seem pretty confident about it. Now they're facing a situation where they probably don't end up with any of them.
Did the Pens get enough in return, do you think, for Neal? Or, I mean, they could have likely gotten more had they kind of created more hype there. But, I mean, for what they got from Nashville, did they get enough?
No. I think at best it's a lateral move. Likely it is a downgrade. And I think, Jim Rutherford said they had 15 teams involved. I think we could probably trust him just for the fact that he's almost brutally honest to a fault. But to me, if 15 teams are involved in a 40-goal scorer, I don't care if he has character problems. I don't care if he has significant issues. I mean, that is a guy that should command overpayment. And we talk about how crazy these contracts were today on July 1st in free agency, but free agency is a mechanism that creates overpayment. It's the natural dynamic of the day when you have 15 teams in on Matt Niskanen. Someone's going to overpay. Someone's going to be unreasonable. And I think the same thing applied to James Neal. 40-goal scores are so hard to come by, and we heard Ray Shero when he acquired Neal in the first place said, you don't get opportunities to find young power forwards in this game that have the capability of scoring 30, 40, and maybe even more goals. And so to be able to put that guy on the market, I think that was Jim Rutherford's chance to really cash in, and I don't think he did it. I think he came away again with a deal it makes sense. I can't say that it was an awful deal, but I think it's a lateral move at best.
Do you recall in recent history with James Neal, we're talking about not getting enough in return, and then after the trade was made, general managers were seemingly admitting that they would have given up a lot more for James Neal, like publicly going out there and saying that.
Yeah, there was. I'm trying to think of the trade, but that did come up where I can't think of the player, but it came up last year where there was a trade where the team basically handpicked where the guy was going, and all of the other teams jumped out afterwards and said, "Hey, we would have loved to have been involved in that." And the one team that we heard that publicly complained a little bit through Darren Drager was Calgary, and I think the case there is you look at Calgary and you think, what do the Penguins want from Calgary at this point? I couldn't name you a package that would blow me away from Calgary without gutting their entire roster. So I think in that sense, from Rutherford's comments, I got the impression that teams were calling him, and we heard that even before he came on and even before they named the head coach, that teams sensed that James Neal was out, and from what I'm hearing now in the days after that, it was all but a foregone conclusion that he was gone due to some incidents that came up and just due to the fact that the Penguins needed to make a change, and he was the easiest guy to move. But I think, Rutherford fielded a lot of calls. He didn't necessarily reach out and maybe explore all the options. And when I look at the final return, to me, it just doesn't give it justice to the fact of the guy that you were trading. Again, despite whatever characteristics or risks or concerns the teams had, I think he's still a 40-goal scorer, and there's a lot of teams that would just give up quite a bit, especially a first-round draft pick, if they had the chance to get him.
So looking at this team today versus this team a month ago, the Penguins that lost in the second round of the playoffs this year, the big knock on them was that there were some major locker room problems. Two guys were kind of key to that locker room, whether they be positive or negative, are gone, being Brooks Orpik and James Neal today. Who takes over this locker room, this team, and kind of sets the tone in that room come camp?
Yeah, that's a great question, and Brooks Orpik was an interesting guy where he had a weird relationship and a weird dynamic where I feel like the media really supported him, despite the fact that he was really a bitter guy. Never really was nice to the media, never interacted with you. But I think people really appreciated the once in a 2-month stretch where he was brutally honest and would give you a great quote that you could build an article around. But I don't get the sense he was very well liked in the locker room. And I'm totally just throwing my opinion out there and have no sense of what really. I think we've seen in the past where players that aren't thrilled with Sidney Crosby or aren't thrilled with the Penguins, they're quickly moved out. And you can maybe even fault Ray Shero in that I don't know that Orpik was bought in at all points. There's been other players where I think he's been a little slow to make the changes. And for Shero, he was a guy that was all about chemistry. Yet in the end, I think, as you alluded to, chemistry was what did him in. And it's interesting. Someone said that to me last night, and I thought, man, that's a great way of putting it. And I think when you look at this team, there's some significant changes there. Christian Ehrhoff, I have no familiarity with what he's like in the locker room. I know Blake Comeau's a pretty solid guy to add in, Nick Spalling as well. And Hornquist, I think, is top of the list. But there are also new players to the team, and it's tough to come in and kind of spread your wings and show how impressive you are without earning that. So it's going to take time for those guys to take over. This is still Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin's team. No matter what changes they've made today or what changes they make in the coming weeks, it's those two guys, and I think you look to them, you look to Chris Kunitz, Pascal Dupuis, you've still got that core in place that's been there for a number of years.
I think it also is interesting. Oh, sorry, Nick. But I think it's also interesting to take that in consideration when you look at who was hired as the head coach. That the Penguins, unlike last time, that they brought a brand new head coach in, didn't have any NHL experience as a head coach. They're bringing in another guy who doesn't have any head coach experience, but he has plenty of not only head coaching experience but life experience in Mike Johnston. There are other candidates that were out there. I mean, Will Desjardins. We even heard that Doug McLean was interviewed for it. These are all older guys, people who are going to be looked, kind of up to almost as a grandpap coming into the locker room. And I use that term not to put them down on any way, but they walk into the room and it's almost like you immediately go to them, because they have that gray hair. You want to hear what they have to say. You want to hear them share their experiences with you, as opposed to some younger guy who's 35, 40 years old as he walks into the room.
Yeah, I think that's a gret point, and that was. All along, I kind of had the sense that Ron Wilson would be the guy they went to for exactly that reason. Is Ken, I think that is a factor, whether we would want to admit it or not. Is Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, they're signed for life. There needs to be a guy that comes in there and commands respect. And how Mike Johnston does it, I don't know him well enough to be able to predict that. But you're going to face a situation where if things go bad, are the players just going to say, yeah, you know what, I trust the coach. He's been there. He's done it before. He's a guy that knows better than me. I'm bought in. I'm all for it. If the Penguins get off to a rough start, what does Mike Johnston say that makes the Penguins and this team buy into what he's selling them. And I think that's going to be the biggest question for me. There's so many open-ended questions here that haven't been answered, and we probably won't have answers till about December as far as where this team goes, because I think with all these changes, it's hard to expect them to come out and be super successful right out of the gate. New head coach, new GM, really some significant changes in the roster, and we look at just what a new coach did to the New York Rangers last year with Alain Vigneault and the October that they had, and just a really rough start. Eventually they pulled it together, but I think there's a lot of wild cards in this Penguins team that if you don't figure out how those dynamics work together and how they come together in tough times, they're potentially devastating effects. And that's where we see teams fall out of really just go into a spiral. And I think the potential's there for this team. I'm not saying that'll happen, but I think there's enough firecrackers, even in a guy like Rick Tocchet that's coming in looking to make an impression. There's enough fuel here that if things go wrong, it could really go wrong in a hurry. And I think that would have to be the biggest concern of the Penguins at this point.
Now, Mike, were you at all surprised to see Marcel Gottsch return? I mean, the team's pretty set at center, aren't they?
If you trust Greg Adams, I think that's the question. Nick, where does
you got
Craig...
Nick Spaulding, you've got Sutter, you've got Malkin, Crosby. I mean, down this whole roster right now, it's pretty deep.
But you know what? The one theme that I really like, and I'll tell you, this is Jason Botterill to me that is really stressing this, is versatility. So every guy they bring in, you hear, oh yeah, he can play right wing, left wing, third line, first line, penalty kill, maybe some power play. To me, that is the approach to take in a salary cap era where you're tapped out. You can't just add guys in the middle of the year. You need versatile players, and we've seen the Penguins when they face injuries in the middle of the year, to be able to have players that you can start the season and say, okay, Nick Spaulding is a third line, right wing. We feel comfortable with him there. But, oh, wait, all of a sudden we've got second line, left wing open. Can Nick Spaulding play there? Yeah, absolutely. Can Patrick Hornquist play there? Yeah, absolutely. Can Blake Como play there? Yes. And I think that's, to me, the most positive sign out of what I'm seeing with these free agent signings today and with where the Penguins have gone this summer. And again, I think that dates back to the Ray Shero era, is having that flexibility, because injuries are inevitable. You're going to have issues, and you're going to need to plug guys in. And if you have a guy that's only a really great third line right wing, that's all he can play. He can't move anywhere else in the lineup, and you're going to have needs where maybe all of a sudden he's your only right wing you have, and you can't have him kind of locked into that third line checking, line role as a right wing. You need to be able to move him around the lineup, and that's what I hear. Marcel Gottsch, I hear Blake Como, Pascal Dupuis, Jason Megna. Those are guys that can move up and down the lineup, any line, any position, and I think there's a lot of value in that.
Did the Pens do enough to address their bottom six? It was a train wreck last year, but it seems like they've really made an effort to try to beef that up, didn't they?
Beef is a good word, Nick. I think they added some beef, some guys that are physical, and I'm not sure they're finished yet, but I think they went out, and I think Como was a good signing, and I think he was $700K or so.
Yeah.
To me, that's good value for him. That's a nice deal. I think he fits well. He's a physical guy. If you watch that Columbus series against Pittsburgh last year, he just punished the Penguins' defense, and that's what the Penguins really didn't have. They didn't have wingers that could punish the opposing defensemen, and if you followed Rick Tocchet on his Twitter account for the last 2 or 3 years, that was his biggest criticism. And so to me, there's a lot of Rick Tocchet in these additions that they're making, is, hey, let's get some wingers in here that can be physical, that can dominate along the boards, and can really leave a dent. And they don't have to be 6'4" or 6'6" like we're seeing in New York with the Rangers, or LA, or Anaheim. I think that's a misconception that a lot of people have, is that to be a physical team or to be an intimidating team, you have to be huge. And I think in today's game, you can certainly be 6'6" up and down the lineup, or you can intimidate with other things, and speed is certainly a factor there. And I think in their own right, Chris Kunitz is what, 5'11", but a very physical player, and he intimidates with the way he plays, even on a defenseman like Zdeno Chara that has 8 inches on him. So I think the way that the Penguins are building this roster, it's part of Shiro, but it's also fixing maybe some of the problems that Ray Shiro had with last year's roster. And what's funny is I think this is the direction Ray Shiro was going anyway. I saw this as kind of a transition plan where last year was going to be a lower cap year. He was going to transition into this year and make some significant moves. And, Jim Rutherford was fortunate enough to come in and kind of take that ball and run with it. And I think we saw the first half of that today.
Let's talk about Rick Tocchet here for a second. This is a guy who has been linked to the city of Pittsburgh for the better part of 25 years now. And as soon as any coaching discussion has come up over the past few years, Rick Tocchet's name is always thrown out there. People want Rick Tocchet to go in there, and they just want to hire him to yell at players after every single Pittsburgh Penguins loss. What kind of a coach is Rick Tocchet going to be in that room? And do you find it at all kind of disconcerting that, look, this isn't Mike Johnston's hire. This is in no way his guy. This is not an assistant that is a part of the team that he would assemble if he was given 100% responsibility to do that.
I can't disagree with anything you said there. I think that, again, and that's why I alluded to one of the biggest risks of this Penguins team is how Rick Tocchet assimilates himself and really sets the tone, as I'm sure he's trying to do in this Penguins locker room. I mean, he seems very excited. He seems very confident. And I think he might have the backing of some in the front office or ownership that gives him that confidence. And that's the biggest concern, I think, for this team is when a guy comes in and he says, you know what, I'm willing to break some kneecaps here. I'm willing to set the tone. And this is a team that needed someone to yell at them and get in their face, and I'm going to be that guy. That sounds great, and I think there's probably a need for that with this Penguins team, with what we've seen in recent years. But you got to be you got to understand the dynamics there. You've got to nail that delivery, because if you don't, you're going to turn off a lot of players. And I think as much as Mike Johnston wants to, he reminds me of Dan Bilesma, honestly, where he's a nice guy from what I can tell. And he needs probably a guy like Tocchet in there, but he can't have Tocchet running around the locker room getting in players' faces, because the players can always shut down on him. I mean, Sidney Crosby signed for a lot longer than Rick Tocchet's going to be in Pittsburgh. Sidney Crosby knows that, and he knows that if he quits on Rick Tocchet or complains about Rick Tocchet's out, not Sidney Crosby. And I think that's the nature of the NHL and of really sports these days with these long-term contracts is if Rick Tocchet wants to come in and be the tough guy in the locker room, he's got to know that he's got a very short leash as compared to some of these star players that are really the core of the Pittsburgh Penguins team.
Yeah, it's almost looking at the disciplinarian that was Herb Brooks in the Disney movie Miracle versus, say, Mike Keenan, who was benching his goaltender every 5 games.
Awesome comparison. Yeah,
it just has to be calculated like that. You can't just go in and start yelling and screaming, especially when you have a room full of a couple of star players who truthfully, for as much as we want to say that they need to be able to take that kind of thing, they're star players. They know it. They get paid 5 times as much as whoever is hired as coach is going to get.
And that's exactly right. I mean, you look at Scotty Bowman's another guy that his career for a while he was that way. And the difference was Rick Tocchet doesn't have the Stanley Cups that Scotty Bowman does. Mike Babcock, players hate him. But the fact is, Mike Babcock has won Stanley Cups, and he can afford to be that way. Can Rick Tocchet as an assistant coach? I don't know. We're going to find out, I think, at this point. But that's really the difference is, we talked about earlier in the show about a head coach coming in with experience or a resume or something that just commands respect from the room. There was a question in Mike Johnston's intro presser about, the fact that he never played in the NHL. And it seemed like a petty question at the time, but the more I spend around this game and the more that I see these front offices and locker rooms and all, that's a factor. And players want to listen to a guy that's been there and been through it, because if they haven't, that's the first excuse is, oh, you don't understand what it's like to play in an 82-game season. And I think that's why you see teams picking up guys like Bill Guerin too, is, Bill Guerin may not be a savvy salary cap guy or contract negotiator, but the fact is he's been in the league. He was very successful in the league, and he was there fairly recently where he can understand, what the challenges and the pressures are on players nowadays. And I think that resonates with players, is they say, you know what, this guy's been there. And even though what he's saying makes absolutely no sense, I'm going to buy into it. And I think the opposite is true. Maybe when you have a guy that hasn't been there, the first thing a player thinks about is, you know what, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And the fact is he's never been in the NHL, so I'm not going to buy into it. And it seems silly to those of us who haven't played in the NHL, but I think it's the more I spend around the game and the more I spend around these players, it's certainly a factor.
It's also a situation where that on-ice success can really affect perception of not only fans but the players who are in the room. If things are going well, that oil and water dynamic can be a beautiful thing, and it can really help this team going forward. But if things aren't going well, it could get ugly real fast. I think we've talked about that a few times today. So that's going to be something really interesting to watch from the beginning of the season to December. If there's a rough patch, what does this Penguins team do to respond to it? And then the coaching staff's going to be a big part of that. Now, looking at the team today, the Pittsburgh Penguins, 17 players under contract now, $8.3 million left of the cap. Is that correct, Mike?
Yeah, that's correct for now, but keeping in mind that they have qualifying offers out there to a few free agents right now. So Brandon Sutter, I think Sutter's qualifying offer was $2.7 million, I believe. Mm-hmm. I think he comes in at 3.5, maybe pushing 4, because it really comes down to comparables for a guy like Sutter and these restricted free agents. So you talk about that. You talk about Nick Spalling. I think his qualifying offer was about 1.5. I think he comes in at 2. And Simone Dupre, I think, will take his qualifying offer, at least close to it, of about $900,000. So you're talking about $3.5 to $4 million on Sutter, $2 million on Spalling, and another $1 million. That eats up a lot of that cap space, and I think that's what Rutherford alluded to today when he was asked, can he go out and get a top 6 forward for Evgeny Malkin's line, which he more or less promised on draft weekend. He doesn't have that cap space right now. And his comment, I think, was someone's got to be pretty creative with the cap right now, at least as far as this roster is currently constructed, in order to get a legitimate player in here. I think they can sprinkle in some depth players, but maybe not getting the top player that originally was planned for as far as Evgeny Malkin's line goes.
Yeah, and it seems like a guy like Kummelin is asking way too much right now, and it seems like he wants to be here, but it seems like they're doing that little fine dance of negotiating to try to get him to take a little bit less so that they could kind of alleviate some of those problems in the near future. I mean, they're going to have to get rid of somebody to kind of fill out this roster, though, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so. The defense, to me, they just talked about how they're going to work their young defensemen in. Well, yeah. Their top 5 defensemen are Chris Letang, Paul Martin, Christian Ehrhoff, Rob Scuderi, and Olli Maatta. That leaves one spot for Robert Bertuzzo and all these young defensemen that you just promised. That I don't buy it. I don't buy that that's going to be the top 5 defensemen. I think they're going to create opportunity for younger guys to come in, because that's the value. Getting Olli Maatta on a $900,000 contract and the role that he played last year, the role that he's potential to play this year, that's the value in the NHL these days. And when you look at the Los Angeles Kings that just won the Stanley Cup, the performance and the contributions they got out of some of their entry-level forwards was the key to their team. It wasn't necessarily the high-end, high-priced guys. It was the fact that they had guys on $800,000 contracts that contributed in a meaningful way. And I think for the Penguins, that's the key. That's why Ray Shero drafted these defensemen. For one, it was to trade to get the fit at winger that he needed, and he knew that young defensemen were very valued in this league, and as we saw today, certainly overvalued, and he knew that he could trade them. But I think he also saw the opportunity that if you can get one of those guys to come in, if you can get Derek Pouliot to come in and play 2 or 3 years on a rookie level deal at $900,000 or whatever he's at, that is value. And it's not just him, it's what that allows you to do with the rest of your roster. Whether it's Christian Ehrhoff and adding him to the defense, whether it's adding a Nikolai Kulemin at forward, it's that flexibility that's really the key impact. And I think that's where they've got to open up a spot at some point to fit one of those guys. Whether that happens sooner or later, I still think Paul Martin's the obvious move there. Yeah. We'll see, but that's the plan I would take.
Now what do you make of the Penguins' backup goaltender situation here? They signed Thomas Greiss today, and earlier this spring they signed Jeff Zatkoff to a 2-year deal. And a lot of people seem to think that Fleury makes too much money for his production, but could they get near the same production from a guy like Greiss?
No, I don't think so. I think Greiss is a nice backup, probably better than Jeff Zatkoff, but I think there's more to that story, and I don't know if it's Jonas Hiller's still out there. I've heard from a couple people the Penguins have looked at him. I don't know how serious that is or how legitimate that is, but whether Fleury's in their long-term plans or Zatkoff is purely a trade chip. I know the Penguins have talked to Los Angeles. Zatkoff was a guy that played in Los Angeles and might be valuable. There's more to that story. You don't just sign a random backup goalie unless the fact that they just don't believe in Jeff Zatkoff. And I for one, was pretty content with what he did last year, especially as a backup goalie. You're not relying on him to play 40 games a year. For what he did and what he's capable of, I think he's totally fine at 20 games a year. So there's more to that story. I don't think we've really seen that play out yet.
Now put on your general manager hat for a second here, Mike.
Oh, boy.
Because we talked about the need to be patient with Paul Martin. If Jim Rutherford is sitting, or if you, Mike Colligan, general manager, are sitting with an offer on the table, and you know that you can get Nikolai Kulemin and Paul Martin, there's an offer where you can make that happen. It might not be the deal that you want, but you can make that happen. Are you still as willing to be as patient, or do you pull the trigger to get a top 6 in here for this season?
Oh, I'd do that in a second. I thought that was their plan from the beginning. Was the problem with trading Paul Martin is you needed a defenseman in there short term to make sure that you weren't throwing too many of these young guys in. You know, Olli Maatta was great, but we've seen what happens. I mean, Matt Niskanen is a perfect example where in Dallas he came in and was awesome as a young defenseman. He played alongside Sergei Zubov, and people thought this guy would be, the next great Sergei Zubov, and his career kind of got derailed after that when he got stuck with Daryl Sador, as Penguins fans know, was certainly not Sergei Zubov, and I think when Niskanen's confidence crashed, so did his career, and so you don't want to put too much stock into what we saw out of Olli Maatta, but certainly a talented player. But as you're bringing these young guys in, you don't want to have a situation where your bottom 4 defensemen are all just brand new players, and you've got that unpredictability. So I think you needed the insulation there. To add Christian Ehrhoff for 1 year at $4 million, that's the insulation. That's exactly what I was thinking. Is if you traded Paul Martin, you probably had to get a guy that could come in and be that short-term transition plan. I think they've got it for free right now from Christian Ehrhoff, and so I think if you have the move on the table to trade Paul Martin, and it's not going to be a team that forces you to take a bad contract in return, which I've heard is every team is trying to unload their bad contracts right now, and even on the Penguins. I think you take that deal and you take the opportunity to upgrade your top 6 forwards as well.
Now, Jonas Hiller actually did sign in Calgary today, but it's a black hole there, so nobody really knew anything about that. So we'll give you a pass there, Mike.
Derek England.
But I do have, Derek England just blew up the whole Twitter sphere up there. But I do have a question here for you, Mike. Should the Pens actually sign a guy like Brian Gibbons? He seemed to do enough last year in about a half a season's worth of work to kind of merit a contract extension. But, I mean, If you were GM, would you make that signing?
Yes, I think as a backup plan, if you can't find your solution at top 6, Gibbons filled in well. I was not a Gibbons fan at all, but when I saw what he was capable of and what he evolved into, he's fine as a fill-in. But again, it's a fill-in, and I think that it's a situation where do you feel comfortable with really starting the season with Brian Gibbons and then replacing him when he gets hurt with someone theoretically worse than Brian Gibbons? I don't think so. I think if I had a situation where, okay, I've got whoever this winger is, and my replacement is Brian Gibbons, yeah, absolutely. I feel fine with that, and I think that's where the Penguins were at last year. The problem was the fill-in became semi-permanent with the Penguins' injury situation, and especially Pascal Dupuis. So I don't think I would go in with your game plan being Gibbons as the top 6 forward, but yeah, if you have the opportunity to sign him, keep him in the system, and somehow keep him as a secondary option there, I think it makes sense.
Yeah, he's one of those versatile guys, like that we were talking about earlier, like a Dupuis, kind of like, a Como, that you can kind of play them up and down throughout the lineup, and he's got enough speed to really, keep up with anyone, anywhere there. So I don't think it would be that bad of a signing either. I think if they could fit him under the cap, if it makes sense, go for it.
And speed is huge on that Sidney Crosby line. I heard so many people talk about options today, and I thought, he's a guy like Dustin Penner. People, I can't tell you how many people told me Dustin Penner would make sense in the Penguins, and I more or less said, no way. There's no way that you can have a slow guy that can fit in on Sidney Crosby's line and be. You can't even be an average skater. And Dan Bilesma took so much heat for Jarome Iginla and supposedly playing him out of position. Well, the fact was, he couldn't skate with Sidney Crosby. So as much as people wanted him on Sidney Crosby's wing, it wasn't going to work. And I know they hardly tried it, but to me, you didn't need to try it. I knew what Jarome Iginla was. I knew what Sidney Crosby's line and his speed was. Jarome Iginla wasn't going to fit there. And I think, Iginla was a perfect fit in Boston because they play a slower game. They bring it down to more his speed. It's more a puck possession, slower cycle game that Iginla can still excel in. But I believe he went to Colorado today. Correct me if I'm wrong. But when I think of Colorado, that's a speed team. Jarome Iginla's not keeping up with Matt Duchene and Nathan McKinnon, I'll tell you that right now, and that's going to be an issue for him today. So we saw a great season out of Iginla last season. I wouldn't be surprised we see him totally flop next year just because of that system. And so I think from the Penguins' perspective, you need fast players that are going to play on a line with Crosby. You can't have average speed guys. It just doesn't work.
3 years, looking at just over $5 million for Jarome Iginla in Colorado. So that is going to be an expensive 3-year mistake, potentially, if you're right about that, Mike. But we're talking about speed. Pascal Dupuis, what's he going to be like when he returns? Is this the same guy? I mean, he's older. He's coming off an knee injury. He was seeming like he was getting better with age. But this could be a significant step back in his progress.
Yeah, I think so, and I heard his progress and recovery wasn't as smooth as maybe they were hoping for, and so I think he's facing a tough point in his career. He's a guy that's always been in great shape, so I don't think we can be concerned about his will to be motivated and to recover, as far as a mental perspective. But I think when you get up to that age, you wonder what happens there, and you wonder over a long-term serious injury like this, what happens. And I think it's going to be a question, but I think he's signed to a deal that makes sense on the third line, and people don't believe in that. Again, he's another guy. I've been shocked at how many people are against Pascal Dupuis. They want to buy him out. To me, he's a solid third line player with what he is and what he's capable of. I think he's still at a fair contract, whether he's on the first line, third line, or both. With that versatility, I think he still fits in well with this roster.
Go for it here, Nick. You kind of touch on what I'm talking about here. So, lightning round begin.
Yes, lightning round. We'll start to end the show here in a few minutes here, but biggest surprise of the day for you, Joe Vitale getting 3 years for $3.45 million, averaging over $1 million a year, or Brooks Orpik getting 5 years, Mike?
Definitely Brooks Orpik. I don't think the Vitality contract was high, but not bad. I think Vitality's a good player. I think he's a fourth liner, but if you look at Sean Thornton and guys like that are really fourth liners that are solid, they're going to get $1 million or a little bit more, and so I think Vitality makes sense in that perspective. And to me, Brooks Orpik for 5 years does not make sense. There's no sense there as far as what we've seen out of Brooks Orpik for 18 months. I just think I can't even envision what Brooks Orpik looks like in 5 years, and to me, that's the toughest thing. So, to me, that was the worst contract.
Rick
of the
Grimes.
And
Does
that
it
was
look like
tough.
Rick Grimes, post-apocalyptic, kind of Walking Dead kind of style? Yeah, it's going to look awful. All right, which team signed the worst contract? Washington with Brooks Orpik or Calgary with Derek Englund?
Oh, Calgary. I just basically said Orpik was the worst, but Calgary, that was mind-boggling. I'll give you guys some info on Derek Englund. He was not thrilled with his hybrid role last year, and at the deadline, I heard that he won't traded. If he was going to be in that kind of forward/defenseman role, he didn't want anything to do with that. So what was funny is I think that may have factored into what teams thought about Derek Englund oh man, we can get a guy that can play defense or play forward or fight people or well, that's about all he does. But
throw him all the money. Yeah.
So with Derek Englund, I don't understand how you get to $3 million, and I don't know who his agent is, but I'd love to meet the guy. I would tell you, that is unbelievable that he got that kind of money for Derek Englund, who doesn't have upside beyond a third-pairing defenseman. And really, he's a nice guy. He's very quiet and reserved, but it seems like a really nice guy. But nice guys don't get $3 million, or else I think all three of us would be rich right now.
No, a couple of thoughts went through my head when I saw Mackenzie tweet that earlier. Okay, report that guy for spam because that's obviously not Bob McKenzie.
I'm
glad I didn't do.
It was kind of a beautiful moment on Twitter because he tweeted it and he tweeted the 2.9 and everyone just immediately assumed, myself included. I think everyone had that.
That was the term.
But yeah, Bob, are you talking about is it 2.9 per or is it over 2.9 years? And everyone's just like, oh, it's got to be over 2. And then to clarify, that is per year. Twitter went batshit. It was beautiful. It was the best moment of the day.
Well, and what's the worst part about that is I've talked to Brad Treliving, the GM now, I've talked to him for years. I knew him in Phoenix, and he was one of those guys I would talk to on a regular basis, and he's about as Moneyball as you get. They were facing situations in Phoenix where it was like, we got to squeeze every dollar out of the pop machine or David Moss or Keith Yandel or whoever we get. And I see him do this deal, and I'm like, God, that's Brian Burke. That is Brian Burke. And then he forces Treliving to go out there and justify it. And I think, man, that's exactly why I heard people didn't want to go to Calgary, because they knew they would have to deal with that. Is your best plans don't matter if you have Brian Burke over there overruling you and saying, yeah, we got to give Derek Englund $9 million. To me, that's the shame of it. And maybe Calgary turns it around, but I think it's disappointing when you see that if you're a fan of the team that they're willing to throw money around like that because of Brian Burke.
Yeah, it was absolutely maddening. I thought for sure Calgary made some kind of clerical mistake. They might have they had to have meant like $900K a year, but they accidentally slipped and hit the 2. It's like, oops, now they're stuck. So terrible contract. I don't blame you for picking that one at all. We'll finish up here with the last one. Bigger steal of the day: Christian Ehrhoff or Brad Richards in Chicago?
Ooh, that's a great question. What happened was I missed a couple hours this afternoon, and I talked to someone midday, and they gave me the update. And what was funny is I was able to kind of go through, and they said, okay, where did Brad Richards go, and what was the price? So it was a good barometer for me to, without any influences, kind of say, yeah, I think Brad Richards would be worth X, and he'd go to this team. And when things were really disconnected, as they were for of course, Brooks Orpik and Derek Englund, to the upside, that was a good barometer for me to say, wow, those contracts are really out of control. But Brad Richards, I could not believe what he signed for. And for Chicago to grab a guy like that, it shows you what a player like him or Ehrhoff thinks is, hey, you know what? I got one opportunity here to kind of pull a Marian Hossa and go there for 1 year, have a chance at a cup, and also get the stats that's going to set me up for a future deal. And I don't think it's a coincidence that both of those players were bought out of significant deals. So the money's not a huge factor right now, but certainly they're setting themselves up for another deal. And I think in Ehrhoff's case, you know, he certainly faces a pretty promising future if he's able to contribute and play even at the level he did in Buffalo last year. I think it ends up looking a lot better. He gets a lot more exposure in Pittsburgh from that case. So that's a tough question as far as what was the bigger steal, but I'll lean towards Brad Richards. To me, that was a great deal, exactly what Chicago needed. I don't know that Pittsburgh definitely needed Christian Ehrhoff, but Chicago needed that centerman, and I think Brad Richards at that price is a great deal.
Well, Mike, thanks so much for coming on and talking some free agency with us. We'll have to do this again shortly.
Yeah, you got it, guys, anytime. And I think the Penguins probably have still a few minor moves in them, but I wouldn't be surprised if they've got some major moves as well. So we'll see how this goes, and we'll certainly see how it goes early in the season as a lot of change, and we'll see how that translates onto the ice.
Hey, were you at the press conference today, Mike?
I was not at the press conference, no.
But I was going to ask. I was going to tell you need to fess up for being the guy who asked Jim Rutherford exactly. So what players are we talking about?
I knew you were going to ask me.
And what did you do with them?
What exactly did you do with these people?
I was literally I was ready to just like see Rutherford just be like, what the F?
Like, he handled it better than Shearer would, I think.
Yeah, you can see that go through his head, but you know he showed restraint.
Oh, that was great. Good times, guys.
All right, well,
thanks.
Well, Mike, we'll see you later.
Take care.